Good afternoon. I hope everybody's as comfortable as I am in an air-conditioned building. Here I am in central Wisconsin. Last time I know that Gene Schrieffer, who talked about livestock animal health, talked about where he was located. I have never said that. I'm actually located in Baraboo, Wisconsin, which is right on the terminal moraine between the driftless area and the glaciated area. It's a very interesting area. So we have both glaciated soils about a mile to the east of my house and driftless soils, which are very different, more like the non-glaciated soils to the west. So in my years as grazing specialist for NRCS, I did see a lot of different soil types and ways of soil management. So that was one interesting thing about where I'm coming to you from today. Uh, but no cooler, I'm sure. We're up in the 90s up here as well, and suffering through the heat, and along with the livestock and everybody else. So today I really want to go over, familiarize you with the grazing plan. Both Matt and I will talk about that and all the aspects of it. But before we get into the basics, formats, and what goes into a grazing plan, I want to talk a little bit about conservation planning. As you know, the Natural Resource Conservation Service has been at conservation planning for 70 years on all kinds of land uses. And we actually have a pretty good format that we've used to go from the very start of the planning process to the developed and implemented plan. So hopefully you can see on your screen that conservation planning by NRCS involves a 9-step process. I don't have the 9-step process on this on the slide, but I'm going to begin with the first step in the 9-step process, which is identifying problems. And in NRCS lingo, we talk about resource concerns, and the resources that we are involved with are the natural resources of soil, water, air, plants, and animals, and human. So we talk about the SWAPA plus H. And the first step of the conservation planning process is identifying problems. The second step is determining objectives from the landowner, which is probably the second most important part, is that we plan on private lands with landowners according to their objectives. And once we do that, then we go into inventorying the resources, and we analyze the inventory of those resources, and then we begin to make alternatives. We look at different alternatives, and um, we analyze them, we look at them, and then from there we go to develop the plan. I select an alternative, and then once the alternative is selected, the plan is completed, and we implement the plan. So let's start with resource concerns. Why would anybody want to, using the conservation planning process, why would you be concerned with resource concerns on cropland when we're talking about pasture land? We're talking about grazing systems. Well, sometimes we haven't chosen the right land use for the sustainable use of the land. Is that, in other words, potentially some areas of cropland may be better off being in grassland, being grasslands, because that was the historically that was their beginning condition before we plowed them up and took the sod out and went into annual crops. So the first thing I'm going to look at is resource concerns on cropland, and then I'll go into resource concerns on existing pasture. Of course, a lot of the resource concerns I'm covering today, I probably covered in the PowerPoint that I did the very first day on why manage grazing, what were the environmental benefits. So the first thing in our soil, water, air, plants, animals process is looking at soils. And soil erosion is probably one of the most obvious forms of resource concerns we may see when we go out to a piece of crop ground that a landowner is interested in converting to grasslands. We have tools to determine the severity of the cropland erosion. We have tools such as a revised universal soil loss equation or the water erosion prediction equation, gully erosion equation, steam and stream bank erosion type things. So uh, another resource concern on cropland would be severely eroded stream banks. We've been cropping quite close to the stream. The stream has been meandering through. Some of the vegetation's been taken off the bank, and all of a sudden you have the sloughing of the banks, and you have a movement of the stream bank. Tools we use to measure that, we have measurement tools of inches or feet of loss per year. We can actually go in and determine the amount of sediment that's going into the streams based on a amount of inches or measurement of bank being lost per year. As a matter of fact, one summer when I first started work in the soil conservation field, my first internship, I walked all the streams of one county, and I located all the stream bank erosion on that county, and made estimates of the amount of stream bank, the speed of the erosion that was going on, and he put it in all into an equation, determine number of tons of sediment that were leaving in the streams. So it's kind of interesting work. When we get into other resource concerns in soils, we talk about soil quality degradation. Certainly in annual cropping systems, we have compaction due to heavy machinery. And the compaction is caused by the bigger the machinery and the state of the soil moisture at the time the machinery is going over it can determine the level of compaction. We can do field measurements with penetrometers to determine how bad the compaction is. We can dig a hole and look at the soil structure. Look at the type of, if it's a blocky or a platy soil structure in the soil, we can determine that, yeah, there are some issues with compaction. And then just a difference in yields over time can be one of the signs that the soil is having compaction problems. Another soil quality degradation is organic matter depletion. And this is particularly true when you can, one of the signs for this is if you can determine the percent organic matter in the soil through a soil test. And one of the criteria for our sandier soils is if you get below 1% organic matter, we get into a situation where we have a resource concern. Less than 3% on other types of soils, more silty soils, fine textured soils. The other way to determine if your organic matter is being lost is just looking at the color of the soils and the structure of the soils as well. Doesn't have the same kind of structure as I talked about, the granular structure that you would find under grasslands. You can use Russell to determine the severity of it, which would be a soil condition index. And as the index is less than 1, it's saying that organic matter is being lost at a rate that it can't be sustained, and you are in a depleting organic matter situation. Another resource concern is water quality degradation. We certainly in Wisconsin have our share of livestock operations with manure spreading. Sometimes the winter manure spreading, because of the situations with the weather and the manure storage, it can't always be prohibited, be avoided at certain times of the year. We've got situations where the soil is bare and manure is being put on hillsides or places like that due to the circumstances of the winter. And we can measure the water quality, surface water quality, by looking at Phosphorus concentrations in the soil are in doing a phosphorus index in the soil determine the vulnerability of the soil for phosphorus runoff, surface runoff. Or you can do a nitrate index as well to determine the water quality degradation on a soil. So this would be a water resource concern on cropland. Even access sediment from surface water runoff, just ephemeral gullies, sediment deliveries in tons per acre per year downslope. It doesn't have to be a real steep soil, but we can still have sediment delivery, which is going to cause water quality delivery in our streams. You saw the picture in the first session that I did where we had two watersheds come together, a paired watershed where one was coming out of more of a grassland pastures type watershed in early March, and the other stream coming out of a cropland area. You can see the difference in sedimentation occurring in the water quality. The clarity of the water was much different from one watershed to the other. Now, resource concerns on pasture. If we're looking at the resource concerns on existing pasture land, we use a method that we use in NRCS to look at the different indicators, and that would be the pasture condition score sheet. So what I want to do right now is I want to talk about some of the resource concerns on pasture, and I want to refer after the slides on the resource concerns, I want to refer to the pasture condition score sheet and give you an idea on what those indicators are and how to determine at what level we're at with each of those indicators. So the first thing we look at on resource concerns on pasture would be soil resource concerns, soil quality degradation. It's just organic matter depletion. How can you have organic matter depletion in a grassland soil? Well, certainly we can have a problem with plant residue. There isn't much residue there. There's very little plant residue left behind by the animal. The animal closely grazes. There basically isn't much left to break down to add to the soil organic matter pool or the soil carbon pool. We also can have a lack of cover, so that if overgrazing is done to the extent that there's a lot of bare spots in the soil, we have no plant matter to decay and come off. We are relying totally on the roots decaying, and after a certain amount of the roots, the mass quantity of roots is depleted. You don't have the roots decaying at all. So we have a couple things we can look at in our pasture condition score sheet called plant residue and plant cover that we can get an indicator score for. And if that score is less than 4, we can determine that there is a resource concern for organic matter on pasture. Water quality degradation is especially a problem if we're around streams or water courses, water areas, ditches, where we have animal concentration and we have a lack of cover. Where you can see here where animals are on the stream, they are probably managed to be in that stream all season long, or at a point where they're there for a long time and the pastures become degraded. Again, plant residue is very low and a very low cover situation. And we have, all of a sudden, we have sedimentation going into the stream from bank erosion or from crossings where animals frequently drink or cross. Not to say that grazing in streams is a poor practice. There are many other opportunities to graze in stream bank areas, stream areas, riparian areas, if done properly. And if the right pasture conditions are kept, are maintained with lots of cover, good plant residue, certainly a stream bank area can be helped, can be improved by having some grazing to improve the wildlife resources and improve the plant resources along a riparian area. Um, we have degraded plant condition in certain situations where the grazing productivity is not where we'd like it to be. We have either undesirable plants or the productivity is much lower. So we basically have a poor situation with production. And we can look at some indicators on our pasture condition score, such as desirable plants, plant cover, plant vigor is another indication. Um, if we have low plant vigor, which means um, low rejuvenation of plants after they've been grazed off by livestock, the plant vigor is very low. It takes a long time for the grasses to grow back and be restored after a grazing period. So that would be a degraded plant condition situation. Another degraded plant condition would be excessive plant pest. Here we have a situation where we have a tremendous weed infestation coming in. These are very sandy soils, northern Wisconsin, that we did a little bit of monitoring with, and we had a lot of noxious invasive weeds coming in there. And the way we measure that is the site adaptation. The plants that were presently there couldn't survive the grazing. They weren't the proper plants that should have been on that site. And then weeds took with bare ground, weeds took the opportunity to come in and take over that site. Another resource concern is a livestock or animal resource concern. And this is a very kind of a general one that you can use in many cases. Let's say, for example, you can't get to a pasture site. You're in the winter, or you can't see the ground, you can't look at the plants. This is a good one to use if you know that the pastures are not stocked properly. That probably estimated production of the pasture that you can estimate with the producer, or you can estimate off a soil survey. Um, you may not have you may have too many animals for the pasture production there, and so for if the forage supply isn't there, there's a need to feed supplemental feed. And if the situation exists when the producer tells you that they're doing a lot of supplemental hay feeding, you probably know, especially year-round supplemental feeding, you probably know that there is inadequate feed and forage coming from the pasture. So the inadequate feed and forage is really a resource concern from the pasture, not from the total farm feed. So, for example, if you have plenty of stored crops on the farm and you're feeding those to the animals, you could say, well, it's not, there's no inadequate feed and forage on my farm. We're looking at it from a pasture production standpoint. Another livestock production limitation is inadequate livestock water. And what you have here is you have cows along a water area. This just happened to be an old watering tank that they took out the water from and decided to water down below at a much lower spot. And so you have cows keep coming back to where the water was and then having to walk long distances to water, creating basically a poor uniformity of grazing and spending more time at the water area. And then you have what we call livestock concentration areas, bare areas where animals spend a lot of time, say around the watering tank, and other areas much further away do not get good grazing because the cattle don't go there as often. So you have a poor grazing distribution. So the two most common resource concerns we probably see on pasture are inadequate livestock water. There's not enough watering points there to get good grazing distribution, and inadequate forage inadequate forage for the livestock. Those are the two most common on existing pasture land. Okay, before we go to uh, describing practices that can talk about satisfying these resource concerns, I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to bring up the pasture condition score sheet that NRCS has and begin there and describe it to you a little bit. I'm pretty sure that many of you have seen our new 2020 guide to pasture condition scoring. It is new and revised. The old one came out in, I believe, 1992 or 93. We've updated it, making it much easier to be a little bit more, I would say, we're a little bit more exact in our measurements. We have a better way of measuring things rather than just kind of visual. We've included the step point method in there, which is a method of it's a method of pasture inventory where you count the number of points at your toe of your foot when you're walking along. Every so many paces, you count a point and you look at that point and see what the particular species is. It's a good way of telling you percent cover by different species or just overall percent cover of the ground. So with this new pasture guide to pasture condition scoring, we have better methods to cover that. And all of it is identified, is described in this publication. I'm not going to go through page by page of the publication, but it does look at the table of contents, gives you an idea of the indicators for an overall pasture condition score. So the goal is to score each indicator from 1 to 5, 1 being the worst situation for that indicator and 5 being the best, with the 10 indicators to get a total possible score of 50. So by having a possible score of 50, you're able to compare what you would call your best pasture in your locale, your area, to the pasture that you're looking at. So in the guide, we have a description for each indicator, a very lengthy description, talking about it with some pictures, some indicators to talk about more in a document. But the actual score sheet itself is an Excel document, and that is something that I want to show you because it's very it has a good summary of each indicator to each level, and it's where you would document the actual rating for each indicator. So I'm going to stop sharing the guide, and I'm going to bring up the Excel spreadsheet that shows each indication. You should see the Excel file on your screen right now of the pasture condition score sheet. And I'm going to show you by indicator how the scores are done, how you determine what score something gets. So you would do this for each pasture area that's different. So in other words, if you have, say, a pasture in the bottomlands, and then you have a pasture up on the hillside, or you have a pasture that has different problems, then you would do a pasture score sheet. There's no real standard for, you do a pasture condition score sheet for 1 every 10 acres or something like that. It just depends on the landscape that you have and the type of pasture. So you would begin with the first indicator, which is percent desirable plants. You want to know, first of all, are the plants in your pasture mostly desirable, or do you have a pasture just of weeds? It may have good ground cover. It may look really good. It may be good for the soil, but it's not desirable plants that animals want to eat. So, in order for us to determine some of the other features like plant diversity and things like that, you can have a very diverse stand of weeds, but it's not going to be scored very high because all those are not desirable. None of the plants are desirable. So, in order to score a 60 or above, which is your 4 points, that is getting into the good or excellent. 4 and 5 are into your good and excellent situation. As we get below 3, we have a poor stand. We have a lot of improvements to make. And desirable species are done by dry weight, not by percent cover. That's because uh, dry weight actually determines a lot more about what kind of production you're getting off from that species versus what's covering the ground. So, for example, legumes may show to be a high amount of the stand, high cover amount of the stand, but in dry weight wouldn't be that high because of the fact that um, they're mostly leaves and don't have as much mass as a grass plant from the top down to the bottom. So the next thing we're looking at is percent legumes by dry weight, and in any pasture, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, we need to have um, at least 30% legumes for it to be sustainable. And that's going to be sustainable for providing nitrogen, providing quality nutrition for the livestock, uh, good protein source, and to keep the grasses growing well. So we're looking at um, percent legume. We can also have too much legume. So if we get down to more than 50% of the legumes being of the bloating type, such as alfalfa, clovers, um, you know, they would be too much, and we would score that very low as well. And then we're looking at live plant cover. This is just the cover of the ground. And we want to know how much cover there is. Most pastures in the higher rainfall areas of the country, basically east of the Mississippi, are probably going to have between 80 and 100% cover. It's going to be really rare to find less than 80% cover if there's no animal concentration units or no bare animal areas that have been bare because of um, just heavy overstocking or watering facilities, or watering tanks around them. So um, usually when you do a line point, a step point analysis, you're going to find at least 80% of living leaf area. Um, it also includes dormant leaves. So if you'll say, well, you're out there in the fall and this is in November and everything's turned brown, well, those are dormant plants. So you want you want those to be there as percent cover. It's not just live, it also includes dormant. If you're out there in the growing season and everything's dead, then yeah, you can't count that as live plant cover. The next thing is plant diversity, and that's pretty important to have a diversity of species, of desirable species. So first of all, if you don't have at least 50% in your pasture of desirable species, you would give this a 1, even though maybe you have a whole diversity of undesirables. So if you have less than 50% of desirable species in your pasture, give it a low diversity anyway, just because um, you need to get desirables in there. And what we're looking for in desirable species, plants from basically 3, if not 4 functional groups: cool season grasses, warm season grasses, legumes, and non-leguminous forbs. Those are the 4 groups that you're really looking for. So if you have uh, 3 dominant functional groups, you're up there. Uh, you're up there in the 4 and 5, very high diversity. To get 4 dominant species in 3 functional groups, uh, and you're pretty much going to be at a high diversity there. So what you're looking for is legumes, cool season grasses, and desirable broadleaves, desirable things like dandelions or things that animals will eat, not undesirables. Each state, I know we have one for the Midwest, has a list of their desirable species on their website, or you can find that list of desirable species from NRCS. The I forgot to do this before we started on this, but I asked Jane if she could send a chat in the chat box to give us a website URL where you can find this pasture conditions score sheet and guide the pasture conditions score. And there's also a video on this that tells you more, gives you more information about taking measurements and what to look for. Actually, the video is done by Indiana and it's done out in the field. So it really does show you some examples of some indicators in a poor condition. Plant residue is really what's on the surface of the ground that will give good biological activity. In other words, to the critters in the soil, the livestock biology. So you want some of the ground that's covered with, underneath the leaves of growing leaves, to be covered with residue. If there's very little residue there on the surface of plant residue as litter, you would give it a poor condition. And so that generally the two that'll go together are poor plant residue and overgrazing or overutilization of the plant. So when the soil cover is 80% with good residue and there's no bare soil, you would give it a higher score. Grazing utilization and severity. This is a very good indicator to determine if pastures are managed well. If pastures are grazed evenly throughout, with minimum overgrazing and minimum overgrazed areas, and there's pretty much uniform diversity, uniform utilization throughout the whole pasture, you're probably going to have smaller pasture divisions, because that improves pasture utilization, and you're not going to have any bare spots, or you're not going to have any areas where animals congregate or overgraze. So this is a really good score for pasture management. Livestock concentration areas are paths that you see, areas around trees, perhaps, where there's only one tree in the field and it's bare underneath it, or around a watering tank. So if livestock concentration areas are further than 100 feet from a stream and are not going to the direct surface water, and they cover less than 1/10 of an acre, you may have some areas, but if they're just small isolated spots, you would score it higher than if they are near a stream, for example, on a stream bank, like that picture I showed you, and they cover more than 1/10 of an acre, which you would give a very low score. It brings us down to soil compaction. We have a lot of things to look at in soil compaction. We can look at actually it's the soil health is what it is. It's the whole indicator is soil regeneration and soil health. It looks at soil compaction, how dense is that layer, by looking at the soil surface, and then looking at the soil structure. And then it looks at the roots. If the roots are going straight down or are they going horizontally. Looks at the color. If there's a very light color to the soil, or if it's a wet soil, it's going to have a dark color. it would probably have more organic matter, but you're looking at the color just to tell you if the soil health is in good shape. And then soil life, is there lots of critters throughout? Do you see a lot of earthworms? Do you see a lot of soil life in there? And then there's plant vigor. This is rapid recovery, or is there rapid recovery of the grasses? If the grasses are a light green out there and yellowish, shows that the plant vigor may not be very good. Even in a drought, if you get very low in a drought, even if you get lots of residual in a drought, sometimes you can get yellowish or dark green areas. You need to take that into account, that if it's a weather issue that's causing it to be light green or yellow, say you're in a severe drought, you would take that into account. But for the most part, you're looking at green, uh, dark green forage with lots of it present, and where you know you're going to have a rapid recovery there. Next thing would be looking at erosion. And this is usually a pretty easy one. You don't usually have a lot of sheet and reel in pastures because they have good cover, or wind erosion. But you might be looking at stream bank, or because of overgrazing, you might have a very large gully, or a gully that's forming in a pasture because their animals are moving along that gully, maybe between two forested areas or whatever. So you might look at the most common thing might be stream bank erosion and gully erosion. Usually they don't have too much problem. And when you can see four different parts to this, so which one would you determine whether you get a score of 1 to 5? You look at the worst of these four types of erosion and you score based on that. So the other thing is too, with the regenerative soil, you would look at the worst situation. So if compaction is the problem, you would score that the whole indicator, because of that one compaction area. Same with the erosion. So when we get down, we add up the score, and in this spreadsheet, if I put a number in here, it's going to add it up down below. And for example, if you have a score down in 10 to 15, there's a major effort required to change that pasture. If you get up into the 20s to 30s, improvements would benefit. And if you get up into the 40s to 50s, no changes is needed at that time. You notice that we had for each indicator the 1 to 5. If you relate that back to the resource concern, you can determine, if the resource concern asks you if do you have an indicator such as plant residue less than 4, then you're probably going to have a soil resource concern of organic matter depletion. So that works very well. What we'd like to do for the TSPs is to get them to complete this pasture condition score on existing pastures. That would help the NRCS field office to put those scores into their ranking program, which determine how the ranking is for a financial assistance project. So it's important that you complete this pasture condition score if you're doing a grazing plan for the grazing management cap as a TSP. So again, if you need more information on this pasture condition score, we've put a link there, and also there's a good video to provide you a lot of information on the pasture condition score. I generally see typical scores in the 20s to 30s if there's a pasture that needs a lot of improvement. Don't very often see anything below a 20. And on some of the very well managed pastures, some of the high intensity pastures, we'd like to get up there in the 40s to get a overall pasture condition score. And it's really important to do that over time as well, to see if as you work with the producer to see if pastures are changing over time. Are legumes going out? Are we losing legumes? Do we need to add more legumes to the pasture? Are there problems with vigor? And is the grazing being done well enough to keep the vigor up? So those are all things we can do to improve pasture condition. I want to stop sharing the pasture condition score now, and I'm going to bring back the PowerPoint um, on resource concerns. Okay. So what are the practices that we could use to improve the resource concerns? Well, if you look at prescribed grazing and forage and biomass planting, those are really our two flagship practices in the grazing world in NRCS. Because of the fact that many of the other practices are what we call facilitating practices that allow us to implement that system of grazing management. So with the prescribed grazing and the proper planting, the proper species being present, we can solve a lot of those resource concerns from soil all down to plants and livestock limitations. Um, Now, if you start looking at some of the facilitating practices, like as fence, you still can use the same resource concerns because you're installing fence to implement the prescribed grazing practice. And the forage and biomass planting usually goes together with the prescribed grazing plant practice. So the fence would facilitate that. So you've got a fence to divide out those pastures, so you can get more uniform grazing going on, and you can follow the grazing plan, the rest rotation scheme, by using the fence. You could also solve some particular problems in the pasture if you had ephemeral gully erosion. You could fence that gully out separately in a separate area, and repair the gully, and then you would graze that at a different frequency than the rest of the pasture. The same with, say, a classic gully or stream bank area. You could use the fence to divide that out as a sensitive area or a separate area you would treat differently than the rest of the pasture. Livestock pipeline and water facilities, same kind of thing. It's a facilitating practice. A lot of the same kind of practices resource concerns you could use for that as you use for prescribed grazing. So soil quality degradation, by having good distribution of animals, you're not going to have any one particular place where the animals are causing compaction. And the water quality degradation in plant and so on down to the livestock production limitations. Livestock pipeline and watering facility actually improves the production of the pasture because it allows the rest periods to be very much evenly distributed around the pasture. Therefore, you get good regrowth and higher pasture production. What about trails and walkways? Again, a facilitating practice has the same kind of resource concerns. It may, by putting in, say, a trail across the ephemeral gully, or you could use a crossing, and you could have the fence fence that out separately, but to get across to get to the other pasture on the other side, you could put a crossing in, which would be a trail, what we call a trail. It has either at grade crossing, so it crosses the gully without a culvert, or one with a culvert in it. Same with a stream. Um, you would get animals across that stream with a crossing, and that would avoid having to cross on a steep bank where animals would slough the banks off and put sediment into the stream. So a lot of the crossings that are done by NRCS are done what we call at grade crossings. so that we don't have to deal with excessive rainstorms and 100-year floods and things like that with culverts, so that we can get a crossing, we can um, reduce the slope down to that down to the bottom of that creek, and a nice even slope, a nice reduced slope that animals can go down, and we can have some kind of a more firm walkway across there. Underneath the water, cattle don't mind walking through the water as long as they have a firm bottom on the bottom. Maybe some stone and some fines down there on top that they can get across the stream and not do any damage to the banks or the stream bottom. Okay, I want to talk just a couple minutes before we go on to Matt, and Matt's going to cover this in more detail about the grazing management plan. But I want to talk a little bit about what's involved with the grazing management plan. So it's a site-specific conservation plan that we're developing with the client that addresses the resource concerns that we just talked about with grazing type practices, grazing related practices, and grazing design. So, for example, we're going to determine that prescribed grazing is our flagship practice. We're going to give the producer a design for that practice, an alternative design, or many more than just maybe one design, but designs on that particular practice. So not only are we going to do the plan that determines that prescribed grazing is needed, and fence and watering systems and facilitating practices, but we're also going to design some of those more agronomic practices. So on a grazing management plan, only a TechReg certified technical service provider can write a grazing management conservation activity plan. And this is in the administration of our financial program. So to get for the producer to get reimbursed for the grazing plan, they have to have a TechReg person write that. They can't write it themselves and get reimbursed, or have an agency person from, say, the Illinois Department of Agriculture write it. It has to be a TechReg certified provider, technical service provider, who has met the criteria for education and training on our technical registry. It must meet the planning criteria. In other words, it must indicate the resources concerns. So, for example, movement from cropland to pastureland, you have to identify the resource concerns on cropland. They're going to be able to be solved by planting forages and planting grasses and doing grazing. And it has to meet the client's objectives. If it doesn't meet the client's objectives, there's no sense to write it, because this is a client's plan that they're going to use to implement a grazing system that's going to benefit their livestock and their land. And they're actually receiving the financial assistance to do that. So first they receive the financial assistance to get the plan written, and then further down the line, when the plan is written and the schedule of practices is up, the number of acres, number of feet of fence, the type of practices needed, then they can go ahead and receive, maybe perhaps receive financial assistance to install those practices, or have an explanation, or basically a method to describe how to install them, or through a mentoring system with another producer to determine how to install those on their own. So the grazing management plan criteria is located on the TechReg site. Go to USDA NRCS.gov, NRCS and go to our TechReg site, and you can see all the things that need to be in that grazing management conservation activity plan. A lot of background information. The real obvious stuff is landowner name, address, location of the map, location and map of the map. We like to see a soils map as well as an overall orthophoto, um, uh, basically an aerial photo. Um, the objectives of the client need to be clearly discussed. We need to look at the inventory of soils. In some states, they have forage suitability groups or forage production groups. If your state has those, include those in there, or at least just have a soils map and inventory of the soils, because that's important down the road in doing your animal forage balance. You need to have an inventory of what plants are existing, the animals that the producer has, and the number of the animals the producer would like to have. So if the producer doesn't have many animals now, would like to have a grazing plan for a certain number of future herd size, you would have that in there. The acres available for grazing, so the land that could be used for grazing, with the proper animals, a documentation of what's already existing there, what fences are existing, what watering systems there. So right now, and then a pasture conditions score. If you have existing pasture condition, if you have existing cropland condition, you would just show the inventory of the soils, the objectives of the producer, acres available for conversion, and everything else would be future conditions and resource concerns. You also need to have desired future conditions. In other words, what plant species composition they would like to have on that pasture. If it's not there right now, they want to change that composition a little bit, or in a cropland situation, they want to plant certain species composition. What mixture of plants do you recommend? What mixture of plants will be planted? And you want to know what the animal demand and forage availability is. That a balance? Is that going to be balanced? In other words, we're going to be doing a animal demand forage availability balance sheet that Matt's going to go over to make sure you have the proper carrying capacity on that pasture as well. The fencing that's going to be needed is need to be shown on a map, that proposed fencing and proposed water locations, as well as designing the forage and biomass planting, or the hay and pasture plantings mixtures that you're going to be putting on there, and a record keeping plan. In other words, a plan that how you're going to keep track of your production on your pasture. You're going to keep track of your monitoring. The most logical things in pasture record keeping is keeping track of how many grazings you get on each pasture every year. It's very important, because then you can see how your pasture production changes over time. So in that documentation, you need your plan map, which is the aerial photo, generally with the field boundaries, pasture divisions, fencing, where fencing is going to be located on your pasture divisions. Also, where your sensitive areas are. If you have areas that are like don't have the same grazing frequency, are either very wet areas, waterlogged areas, or forested areas that maybe could use 1 or 2 grazings a year, you would locate those. Or even wintering areas that you don't want animals wintering on, areas that you think are too close to water, to a water course, where you don't want any wintering going on there, or bale grazing. A soils map with perhaps some kind of if you have a soil production rating in your state, or just a soil inventory map of the soils description. And then the resource concerns again, a forage balance sheet with carrying capacity, and a plan for situations where you have extreme drought or extreme wet conditions. Where are you going to put those animals? Where are they going to be? Is there going to be a lot for them? A lot where they can be put on concrete, or is there a sacrifice area where you can put them when you don't want to have them on the pasture? A schedule of practices, amounts, implementation dates. And then site-specific designs for the prescribed grazing, for the fence, for the forage planting, and brush management if necessary. For the engineering designs, for like the pipeline, the tanks, animal trails and walkways, we don't require the technical service provider to do those designs because they're agronomists and not engineers. And we usually use our engineering, NRCS's engineering specialists to do those designs. I was going to show you a grazing plan, example grazing plan, but I think Matt's going to show you that in the next presentation. So I am going to stop right there and let him take over.